It's strange the way silence sounds on your wedding day. I woke before the sun. No alarm. No noise. Just that thick suspended hush that hangs in the air right before something breaks. I sat up in bed and for a second forgot what day it was. The house was still. My hands went straight to the nightstand drawer, the second one down, where I keep all the things I don't want guests to see. That's where the old letters live, the ones I used to write to myself after therapy. I pulled one out and read the date, June 3rd, 2019. Dear Ellen, it began today. You remembered how to stand up straight again? I hadn't read that one in years. My name is Ellen Breyer. I'm 39. I own a flower shop in a town where people still wave at their neighbors from the driveway. I've never made a scene in public, never once raised my voice at a stranger. I was raised by a mother who taught me the power of restraint and a father who taught me the cost of it. I've spent most of my life being quiet, but quiet doesn't mean soft. Not always. The sunlight was just beginning to stretch through the curtains when I heard her voice outside the door. Lila, my sister, laughing. It was her laugh that woke the rest of the house. She didn't knock. She never does. She just pushed open the door and stood there barefoot on the carpet, holding a coffee in each hand. Big day, she said. Her smile was wide and bright, a little too bright, like she was performing. I nodded and forced a smile. Thanks for the coffee. Then I saw what she was wearing. A white dress. Not pure white ivory technically, with soft beading on the sleeves, and a belt tied in a silk knot at the waist. It looked expensive, delicate. It looked like something I might have picked for myself a few years ago, before I knew better. Lila spun once in place, her blonde hair catching the light. Too much, she asked, but it wasn't really a question. It was something else. A dare, maybe. A warning. I stared at the tiny pearls stitched into the neckline. Like teeth, I thought. Hundreds of small, gleaming teeth. No, I said. It's fine. She sipped her coffee and sat on the edge of my bed, right where our mother used to sit when we were sick as kids. I couldn't help but think how comfortable she looked there, like this room this day belonged to her. Jason texted, she said casually. He's already at the venue. Nerves are kicking in, but he says he can't wait to see you. I nodded again, not trusting myself to speak. Jason. My fiancé. The man who once told me that he'd never loved anyone as quietly as he loved me, like it was something sacred. Now when I thought of him, all I could see were things I'd never asked to see: a gold earring in his truck's console, a freckle I didn't know Lila had, a hallway door closing too fast. Still, I let her sit there. Let her talk. Let her wear white. I think I wanted to see how far she'd take it. The morning passed in a blur of makeup brushes, camera clicks, and mimosa glasses. People floated in and out of the room like ghosts in chiffon. They called me beautiful. They asked if I was ready. I smiled and nodded. I told them yes. But inside, something else was moving. I stepped away for a moment to breathe, to think, to be alone. Downstairs in the guest room, I opened my mother's old jewelry box. It's shaped like a little house with a rose carved into the lid. I'd kept her brooch tucked away for years, saving it for this day. A gold oval with a hand-painted portrait inside, a woman in profile, eyes turned down. Quiet. Watching. I pinned it to the inside of my dress near the ribs. You'll know what to do, my mother had once told me. You always have. In the mirror, I looked like someone else. Someone steady. Someone no one expected. As I walked back upstairs, I paused at the top of the staircase. The hallway stretched long and empty ahead of me. I saw Lila at the end of it, laughing into her phone. Her back was turned. Her voice lowered to a whisper, and I watched her body angle toward the wall, like she was protecting something. She didn't hear me come up behind her. Everything okay? I asked softly. She jumped a little, turned too quickly. God, you scared me. Sorry. Just Jason, double-checking the music list. You know how he gets. I nodded, and we stood there in silence. Her cheeks were flushed. She didn't meet my eyes. After a moment, she reached out and touched the veil tucked under my arm. You're going to be a beautiful bride, Elle. I smiled, a small, tight curve of the mouth. Thanks. But all I could think about were the doors. The ones that were always left slightly open. The ones that should have told me everything if I'd been willing to see. That's the thing about silence. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes it's waiting. Sometimes it's a room full of people who pretend not to notice the white dress in the front row. Sometimes it's the sharp inhale before the vows start. And sometimes it's the sound of your own voice rising after too long underground. 3 months before the wedding, I found a gold earring in Jason's truck. It was small, elegant. A hoop with a little hummingbird charm dangling from the bottom, delicate enough to catch light, not bold enough to stand out. I found it wedged between the seat and the emergency brake while reaching for my cardigan. At first, I assumed it was mine. I wore gold sometimes. I leaned down, picked it up, held it between my fingers. It was warm from the sun, but I didn't recognize it. And I remember knowing that. Instantly. Still, I held it like it was harmless. Like it hadn't already begun working its way under my skin. Jason was inside the gas station picking up coffee. I waited until he came back, then held up the earring, smiling like I wasn't looking for anything. Lose something, I asked. He looked at it for a second longer than he needed to, then shook his head, reached for the steering wheel. That's my sister's, he said. She borrowed the truck last weekend. I think she went out with some friends. I nodded. Right. You okay? He asked, his voice tight, like he already knew he'd been clumsy. I smiled. Of course. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. That night I took my mother's brooch, the one I'd planned to wear on the wedding day, and placed it back in its box. I pressed it gently into the velvet, shut the lid, and tucked it beneath a quilt in the storage chest. I couldn't explain it, not even to myself. It felt wrong to keep anything borrowed from someone who'd loved me with her whole body when I was about to say yes to someone who was already forgetting how to hold me. I didn't cry. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed and staring at the floorboards the way the evening light hit them through the blinds. My mother used to say every choice left a mark, even if you couldn't see it right away. That night, I felt something pull just slightly out of place, like the weight had shifted under my feet. It wasn't the earring. It wasn't even the lie. It was how easy it was for him. A week later, I was at the shop when Lila stopped by. She does that sometimes, brings me lunch. I didn't ask for, lingers a little too long around the ribbon drawer. She never wanted to be part of the business, never wanted to touch the soil or clip stems, but she liked the aesthetic, said it smelled like weddings and forgiveness. That day she wore a red sweater and high boots, her hair pinned half up like she was trying to look effortless. She leaned over the counter and picked up a lavender bouquet I was tying off. Are these for that couple from New Hope? I nodded. Their ceremony's this weekend. She tilted her head, smiled. They're cute. Probably still in the stage where they think forever means something. I froze. Not visibly, I don't think, but something inside me twisted. I kept tying the ribbon. They ordered midnight lavender, I said, voice calm. What's the difference? Midnight's darker, less sweet, holds its shape longer after it's dried. She ran a finger over the petals and said nothing. Later that night, I found a stem of it in her coat pocket. She'd left the coat slung over the back of a chair like she always did. I was closing the shop, tidying up. I wasn't looking for anything. Or maybe I was. I slipped the lavender out and turned it in my hands. The stem was bent near the base. Crushed, like it had been pressed into something. The thing about lavender is it lingers. I brought the stem home. laid it on the windowsill in the kitchen, and I waited. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it could have fallen, that she could have picked it up off the floor, that coincidences weren't always omens. But I started noticing other things. Jason's phone lighting up face down, his voice changing when he answered. The way he said Lila's name more often in stories that didn't need her. The time he came to dinner and couldn't remember what day I'd met his parents, a day Lila had spent with us. His mouth opened and she answered for him. Last October, she said. I remember the butternut squash soup. I hadn't made that soup. She had. After they left, I sat on the porch alone with a mug of cold tea and watched the street empty itself. It was a Tuesday night, the kind that usually went unnoticed. I remember thinking, this is how it starts. Not with a scream, but with things left ajar. A coat pocket, a story slightly off, an earring that slips from a hand and lands where you weren't supposed to look. I didn't ask questions. I started writing them down instead. I bought a black leather journal from the stationery shop next to the dry cleaners. I told the cashier I needed it for Vows. She smiled and offered me a pen on discount. I said yes. That night, I opened it and wrote a single line. Which one of them will lie to me first? Then I turned the page, wrote down what I remembered. The earring, the scent of her perfume in Jason's truck, the shade of her lipstick on the wine glass he'd cleared too quickly. I made lists like I used to after my mother died. Lists of things that didn't make sense, hoping they'd become clear once I named them. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't trying to make peace with something I couldn't fix. This time, I was gathering. Doors. They were everywhere suddenly. Left open just wide enough to suggest something. A bathroom door ajar when Jason said he'd be gone 10 minutes. A bedroom door that didn't shut all the way when Lila stayed the night. A door inside me that had stayed closed for years, cracked now just slightly. I used to think betrayal came like lightning, loud, clear, devastating. But sometimes it's quieter than that. Sometimes it curls itself around you like smoke. You breathe it in for weeks before you notice the smell. By the time you recognize the fire, it's already in the walls. There's a kind of peace that only lives in flower shops. Before opening each morning, I'd turn on the lights one by one, the front windows first, then the coolers, then the tiny amber lamp on the work table. I'd stand at the entrance and listen to the hum of it all coming to life. That low, quiet breath of machinery and memory. Flowers are like people. They don't like to be shocked awake. At Briar and Moss, we stocked everything from roses to ranunculus. But I always had a soft spot for lavender. It doesn't beg for attention. It holds its shape. It speaks gently and carries the truth of wherever it's been. If you've ever tried to wash out the scent of crushed lavender from your hands, you'll know what I mean. It lingers, not like perfume, more like a story that keeps retelling itself. When Jason and I first met, we were both different people. He came into the shop by mistake, looking for his friend's hardware store, which had burned down 3 years earlier. I offered to help him find the right street, and he asked if I always smelled like a field in France. I remember how warm that made me feel, and how rare that warmth had become even before the lies. The first year we were together, he brought me lavender every Sunday, bundled in twine. From the farmer's market near the train tracks, I dried each one and hung them in the back hallway of my apartment right above the windows that barely opened. That was our thing, lavender and the light we didn't need to name. But over time, the bundles stopped. They were replaced by dinners, by errands, by obligations that ate at the softness. Not unusual, not dramatic, just slow erosion. Until one morning in late May when Lila came into the shop early. Too early. She didn't knock, just breezed in through the front door while I was still trimming stems in the back. The bell overhead rang like a warning. She wore a cream silk blouse and jeans that looked new. Her heels clicked once on the floor before she saw me. "Oh," she said. "Didn't know you were open. I wasn't." She laughed lightly. I figured. I was just driving by and remembered I never confirmed the centerpieces for the rehearsal dinner. "I've already placed the order." Lila perched herself on the edge of the counter like she owned the place. I kept my hands busy snipping at a stubborn peony that refused to open properly. "That for a client?" she asked, nodding to the lavender on my left. I didn't answer. She picked up a small bundle, sniffed it, and smiled. "You always were the lavender girl." I looked up then, just for a second. "So were you," I said. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. She just set the bundle down carefully as if it were fragile, and started talking about colors, how she thought maybe dusty rose would look better than burgundy. I let her talk. That night, I stayed late. Rearranging stock I didn't need to rearrange. Watering flowers that had already been watered. At some point, I pulled out a fresh notebook and began sketching new centerpiece designs, none of which I intended to use. And then I saw it. Her scarf. Left on the back hook behind the counter, pale yellow with a faint stain near the hem. I reached for it, intending to fold it until I smelled it. Lavender. But not the usual kind. Not the ones I use in bouquets. Midnight lavender. Darker, more pungent. The kind I special order for brides who don't want sweetness. I only had one box of it that week for a high-end June wedding, and I hadn't opened it yet. I walked to the back room, unlocked the cooler. The box had been slit open. 3 stems missing. It felt like a whisper against my spine. Nothing loud, but enough. The next morning, I wrote it down. Midnight lavender missing. Lila. Scarf. Her perfume didn't smell like that last month. I didn't know what to call this list yet. Not a diary, not a plan. Just a ledger. Of moments. Of things stolen. Of how much I was willing to carry before I couldn't anymore. The thing about betrayal is that it's not always obvious. It's not the lipstick on the collar or the hotel receipt. Sometimes it's in the things they think you won't notice. The flowers they borrow without asking. The excuses that sound a little too clean. The way they mention each other's names too softly. Jason came by that evening, claiming he missed me. He brought me a chai from the place I used to love, even though I'd stopped drinking caffeine for weeks. I thanked him, pretended not to notice. He leaned against the doorway like he used to. Easy, confident. Said he'd been thinking about honeymoon destinations, that he wanted to surprise me. His eyes scanned the shop, and they stopped just for a flicker on the midnight lavender bundle I'd placed beside the register. "You still using that kind?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Doesn't smell the same," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I nodded and kept arranging freesia, each stem bending under my hand like a quiet bow. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and held one of the dried stems in my palm, turned it over, watched how it caught the light. I could see her hand touching it, her wrist brushing past Jason's. I could see him reaching for it, remembering me. That was the part I hadn't said yet. Not to anyone. Not even to myself. It wasn't just that they were sleeping together. I didn't have proof, not yet, though every inch of me knew. It was that they were using my things, my symbols, my stories, my flowers. They were borrowing pieces of me to build something in the shadows. And they thought I wouldn't see it. They thought I was still the Ellen who only spoke when spoken to. The one who kept her voice folded up in her sleeve, just in case someone else needed the space to shine. But I was changing. Not all at once. Not with rage, but with clarity. I pulled out the vow book that night, the one I'd told everyone was for wedding drafts. I hadn't written a single vow yet, but I did that night. Just one line. I see you. Even in silence, I see you. The message came on a Wednesday late afternoon. I was in the back room folding napkins for the cocktail tables, an odd little task no one had asked me to do. Something to keep my hands busy while my mind walked itself in circles. The bell above the shop door rang once. I called out, "Give me a second," but no one answered. I wiped my hands on my apron and stepped into the front. Empty. Just the hum of the cooler and a package on the counter. A flash drive in a small white envelope. My name written in handwriting I recognized, but hadn't seen in a while, Talia Stone. A friend from high school. We'd fallen out of touch after college when our lives slid in different directions. She'd been at the bachelorette party, though. Just one night, just for me. There was a note inside folded once. I wasn't sure you saw this. Maybe it's nothing, but I couldn't keep it to myself. Love T. The drive was silver, scratched on one side. I stared at it for a long time before plugging it into my laptop. There was only one file. The footage started mid-laugh distorted audio, someone dancing near the camera glitter falling from the ceiling of the rental hall. I remembered it then. The pink velvet chairs. The too sweet sangria. Someone had set a phone up on a tripod to record the toasts. I didn't remember anyone leaving it running afterward. The frame shifted as people wandered in and out, catching pieces of conversations. Blurry faces, glasses clinking. For a moment, I thought Talia must have sent the wrong thing. Then I saw Lila, near the edge of the dance floor in the deep gold light. She was talking to Jason. They didn't know the camera was still recording. I leaned forward in my chair. He reached for her arm, just lightly. She laughed and leaned into him. He whispered something near her ear. She smiled, not wide, not bold, small, secret. Then they left the frame together. The camera didn't follow. It just stayed there humming, recording the empty space they left behind. I must have watched that part 20 times. Over and over. Each time I thought maybe I'd missed something. A detail. A misread. Something innocent I could pretend was still true. But the silence in that clip spoke louder than the laughter. You know when two people disappear behind a door, you know? Whether they kiss or talk or just sit in a room full of electricity. You know what's real. That was the night everything inside me clicked. Not shattered, not screamed, just clicked. I closed the laptop and sat there staring at nothing. There was no fight, no call, no angry text. I didn't throw anything or break the glass vase beside me, though I thought about it. Instead, I went into the back room and pulled out the vow book. Turned to a fresh page. You did this when you thought I wasn't looking, I wrote. But I was always looking. I just needed to know which truth was mine to carry. I slipped the flash drive into a drawer behind the register. Didn't tell anyone, not even Talia. Some part of me needed to protect the moment. Not for them, for me. The next few days, I moved like someone watching themselves from outside their body. I kissed Jason when he dropped by, asked about the venue, laughed at the right moments. I listened when Lila went on about table runners and signature cocktails. I did everything a woman about to be married was supposed to do. But behind my eyes, I was already leaving the house they'd built inside me. I started noticing mirrors. The one above the register that tilted just enough to show the sidewalk. The one in the hallway at home where Jason used to fix his tie. The compact mirror in my bag that cracked after the bachelorette night. I hadn't bothered to replace it. Mirrors lie sometimes, but not always. They can also show you what you refused to see before. At night, I'd lie in bed beside Jason, his back turned, his breath slow. I'd stare at the ceiling fan and wonder how many stories women had told themselves just to survive something like this. How many had stayed? How many had swallowed it whole? But I wasn't going to be one of them. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, not exactly. But I knew I wasn't going to hand myself over without a say. The next morning, I drove to the venue. The woman in charge, Margie, was surprised to see me. "Thought you were sending your sister for the final check-in," she asked. I smiled all teeth. I decided to come myself. We walked through the garden ceremony space. It was beautiful. Ivy-wrapped trellises, white rose garlands, low stone benches. There was a stillness to it, like it was waiting for something holy or wicked to happen. Margie asked if I wanted to practice the walk down the aisle. I said no. I already knew how to walk. It was the stopping I needed to prepare for. On the way out, I passed a mirror in the powder room and paused. For the first time in weeks, I looked at my reflection and didn't flinch. I saw a woman who'd been careful, watchful, who had waited. Not because she was weak, but because she knew that when she finally spoke, no one would be able to pretend they hadn't heard. When I got home that night, I pulled out the vow book again, wrote one more line. You don't have to scream when the truth is shaped like a blade. The dinner was my idea. Jason thought it was sweet. "You, me, and Lila," he said, half laughing. "You're brave." I told him it was practical. We needed to go over rehearsal details, seating, last-minute catering adjustments. But really, I just wanted to watch them sit across from each other. I wanted to feel the weight of the triangle they'd built in my absence. So I made lasagna, the same kind our mother used to make, 4 layers enough cheese to hush the room. It always made things quiet. I set the table with linen napkins and white plates rimmed in gold. I added fresh rosemary in a mason jar at the center. Warm, homey, unthreatening. The illusion of welcome. Lila arrived first, wearing a blue sweater and lip gloss the color of diluted wine. She hugged me too tightly, like someone trying to get back inside a room they'd already burned. Jason came 10 minutes later, carrying a bottle of red and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He kissed my cheek. His lips were cold. We sat, 3 forks on each side of the table. I poured the wine. The room filled with the scent of baked tomatoes and salt. "I was thinking," Lila said, unfolding her napkin. "Maybe we should shift the first dance later in the evening, after dessert." Jason nodded too quickly. "That actually makes sense. Creates momentum." They looked at each other just a second too long. I smiled. "It's your wedding after all." Jason blinked. "What I said, it's your call," I replied, sipping slowly. "You both seem to have a rhythm." He laughed nervously. "Come on, Elle." Lila's fork scraped against the plate. "You know she didn't mean anything by it." "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it," I echoed softly. They moved on. Or tried to. Talked about floral backups in case of rain, joked about our cousins' toast habits, rehashed venue logistics I'd already memorized. I watched them talk. Their voices never overlapped, but they always followed Lila's ending where Jason's began. A strange choreography. I'd never noticed it before. Or maybe I had and chose not to see it. It's easy to confuse closeness with familiarity, especially when the betrayal comes wearing your sister's perfume. At one point, Jason leaned back, looked at me and said, "You've been quiet." I tilted my head, folded my hands. I'm listening to what I let the silence sit, everything that's not being said. He tried to laugh. It didn't land. Lila reached for the wine bottle. Her hand shook slightly as she poured. I stood up. "Anyone want more garlic bread?" Neither of them answered. Their eyes followed me into the kitchen. I sliced another piece slowly, counted each press of the knife, thought about how many times I'd cooked in that kitchen believing love meant service. believing quiet was safety. When I returned to the table, the room felt colder. Or maybe it was just me beginning to feel the weight of everything I hadn't said. "I've been thinking about vows," I said, sliding back into my chair. Jason perked up. "Yeah, what kind of tone are you going for?" "Honest," I said. "Something true. That's all that matters." He nodded, reaching for his wine. "Truth's important." Lila didn't speak. She just stared at her plate. "You know what I realized?" I said, almost conversational. "The word vow comes from the Latin votum, a promise, yes, but also a wish." Jason tilted his head. "I didn't know that." "A wish with weight," I said. "One that costs you something." No one spoke. The rest of the meal passed in strange politeness. Empty seconds padded with weather talk and half smiles. They didn't touch each other. Not directly. But their bodies knew. I could see it in how they leaned, how they mirrored. After dessert, they left quickly. Too quickly. Jason kissed me again, cheek light, guilt-ridden. Lila hugged me like a cousin at a funeral. When the door shut, I locked it. The house was still. The table looked like a stage after curtain call. Napkins, folded glasses, half-full plates, pushed back as if by actors trying to leave the scene unnoticed. I turned off the lights. Then I went to the sink and began to wash each dish by hand. I didn't rush. I scrubbed the pans until the heat from the water turned my hands red. I stood in the dim light of the kitchen window, watching my reflection in the glass. My face looked pale, firm, like stone softened by rain. At one point, I dropped a wine glass. It slipped from the soapy sponge, hit the rim of the sink, and shattered. It didn't even sound sharp, just a clean snap like something being set free. I stood there for a moment, staring at the pieces. Then I picked up one shard, held it between my fingers. It was smooth on one side, jagged on the other. I pressed the sharp edge lightly against my thumb. Not enough to break skin. Just enough to feel the resistance. There was something honest in that pressure. After I cleaned it up, I walked into the living room and opened the vow book. The ribbon marked where I'd left off. I wrote, "When a home burns slowly, the smoke becomes part of the walls. Some people keep breathing it in. Some people open a window." Then on a new page, you sat at my table. You used my plate. You smiled like the lie had a flavor. I hope it tasted like rosemary. That night, I slept alone. Jason had offered to stay too much wine he'd said might just crash here, but I told him no. Said I needed a bath and space. He didn't argue. Before I went to bed, I looked out at the street and saw their cars parked across from each other, facing opposite directions, like two travelers who'd met in passing deciding whether to say goodbye. There's a wooden box in my bedroom that no one knows about. Not Jason, not Lila, not even my closest friends. It used to belong to my mother, carved maple slightly uneven on one side, with a brass latch that sticks if you don't open it gently. She kept her love letters in it back when such things still meant something. Letters from my father mostly, some dated all the way back to high school. I used to sneak in and read them when I was 12, imagining a world where longing could be folded into paper and sent somewhere safe. That box became mine after she died. I emptied it, kept it anyway. Lately, it's filled up again. I write letters now. To Jason, to Lila. To the version of myself I had to bury just to get here. I don't send them. That's not the point. I write them because I need to name things, and I've learned there are truths too sharp to say out loud. The first one started simply, "Dear Lila, I still remember the night you broke your ankle on the swing set. You were 8. I carried you home barefoot, your sobs soaking through my shirt. I would have done anything to keep you from hurting. I didn't know then that one day I'd need saving from you." That was the first time my hand shook while writing. I stared at the page for a long time after I signed it, as if the words might disappear if I didn't look too hard. They didn't. They settled. The second letter was to Jason. Dear Jason, do you know what silence tastes like? It's like copper, like dust, like a voice pushed so far down it starts to rot. I stopped speaking long before you stopped listening. But here's the truth: I always heard you, even in the lies, especially there. That one I folded 3 times like I was preparing it for war. There are more now, maybe a dozen. Some just a few lines, some pages long. None of them polite. They're honest, in ways I didn't know I could be stripped of charm, elegance, tact. They don't care how they sound. One of them starts, how do you betray someone who gave you shelter when Dad left another? I would have died before hurting you. You use that like currency. I don't write these late at night. I write them in the daylight, between deliveries, between emails. In the hour after lunch, when the shop is quiet and the hum of the fridge sounds like a heartbeat trying not to speed up. I hide them beneath the quilt in the box, right next to the brooch. Each one is a piece of the foundation I'm rebuilding under myself. Because the world I lived in before the one where I believed in closeness and shared blood and vows spoken and promises held, it's gone. They took that from me, and I don't want it back. What I want now is space, air, something unvarnished. Not revenge, not exactly. Just a place where my voice isn't a courtesy. Last week I found a note in Jason's pocket when he left his jacket on the back of a chair. A tiny scrap of paper with a scribbled time and address. Nothing else. I Googled it. It was a hotel, on the other side of town. I didn't go. I didn't need to. Instead, I wrote, I wonder if the sheets smell like me. If you ever reach for her thinking you'll find the version of me who still loved you. I didn't cry while writing it. The tears aren't mine anymore. They're hers, the girl I was when this all began. She gets to keep them. I'm not hers now. A few nights ago, I dreamed I was walking through the house barefoot and every room was empty. No furniture, no pictures, just doorways and windows. I opened each one and wine came rushing in, but instead of cold, it was warm. It smelled like rosemary, like ash. I woke up feeling lighter, not healed, just aware. That same morning, I added a new entry to the vow book. Not all beginnings are sacred. Some are simply exits with better lighting. I've been thinking about the word ownership, how we use it to describe property ideas wrongs. But what about wounds? What about silence? I've carried this thing quietly wrapped in ritual like it would unravel if I let it breathe. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe letting it breathe is the only way I'll survive it. This afternoon, I walked into the guest room where Lila always sleeps when she stays. I opened the closet, checked the drawers. There were still pieces of her here. A bottle of perfume, a pair of shoes, a silk robe, the kind that slinks when you move. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it all, and I felt nothing. No spike of rage, no ache, just a steady hum, like an engine preparing to run. I've begun drafting a new letter. Not for her, not for him. For me. Dear Ellen, you don't need to be understood to be whole. You don't need to be pitied to be powerful. And you don't need their apology. You already lived through the wound. That was the hard part. The rest is yours now. That one I might actually keep outside the box. Maybe frame it, maybe tape it to the inside of the vow book. I don't know yet. But I do know that when I speak my vows, I won't be speaking to Jason. I'll be speaking to the woman who walked through all of this and still knew how to put one foot in front of the other. Still knew how to carry fire without burning everything down. Rehearsals are meant to smooth the edges. Make the movements feel natural. as if you could rehearse your way into a life you didn't quite belong to. I wore a pale blue wrap dress, the color of quiet oceans and hospital hallways, the same shade my mother wore the night my father walked out. She didn't scream, didn't beg. She stood at the sink, drying a dish, turned once and said, "All right then." I was 15. Lila was 10. I remember her hiding behind the living room chair, holding a towel like a shield. I told her we were better off. She asked if we'd still go to church that Sunday. It was the wrong question, but I answered it anyway. Now, 24 years later, I stood in a vineyard just outside town waiting for a man who'd already left, just not officially, and for a sister who thought she could disappear inside white silk and careful denials. The venue was too perfect. Grapevines twined around pergolas, paper lanterns waiting to be strung, tables with our names printed in soft calligraphy. I walked the gravel path in nude heels and let the wind wrap itself around me. Jason showed up late. Lila was already there, coordinating something with the caterer, her laugh ringing through the trees like wind chimes on a porch you don't sit on anymore. He kissed me, lightly, like someone touching a wound to see if it still hurts. "Everything looks great," he said. I nodded. "It does." The officiant, a woman named Carol, began the walk-through. She gestured where we'd enter, where we'd stand when we'd speak. I memorized the steps. Not because I planned to use them, but because I wanted to know exactly where I'd be when the truth came down. At one point, Carol asked us to hold hands. Jason's were cold, not shaking, just cold. I wondered if he knew, not just what I'd seen, what I'd guessed, but what I'd become. What silence had done to me in the last few weeks. It didn't make me bitter. It made me precise. Afterward, we walked through the reception hall. Lila joined us there, beaming like a debutante. The decorators had strung soft amber lights across the ceiling, casting a kind of artificial magic on everything below. It almost worked. If I were someone else, I might have believed in it. Dad was there too, with Cheryl, his new wife. She smiled too hard, called me sweetheart, and told me how proud my mother would have been. I thanked her. She didn't hear the hollow in my voice. I don't think she's ever looked me in the eye long enough to see much of anything. During dinner, Lila told a story about me as a child, how I used to cry whenever she fell, even if she wasn't hurt. "She used to act like she broke the bone," she said, laughing. I smiled. "She's always been that way," Dad added. "Felt things too deeply." Jason looked at me then. Not lovingly, curiously, like I was a painting in a hallway he'd passed 100 times, but never really studied. "Do you remember that trip to Cape May?" Lila asked. "The one where we all got food poisoning?" Jason nodded, laughing. "Elle, didn't you swear off clam chowder for life? You're thinking of her?" I said, tilting my chin toward Lila. "She was the one who puked in the car." The table got quiet for half a second. Then Cheryl laughed. "Well, I'm sure someone had a bad time." I excused myself not long after. The reception hall was still half lit. The decorators had gone. Only a few staff remained cleaning the tables and rolling up extra linens. I slipped outside to the garden path and walked it alone. The air had cooled, the vines rustled. In the distance, someone was playing a piano from the lounge, something minor, low, and unresolved. I reached the altar and stood where I would stand tomorrow, a place meant for joy. And I felt calm, not numb, not angry, just prepared. Behind me, I heard footsteps. "Jason, you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine. You left early." "Too many people," I said. "Too much remembering." He reached for my hand. "Tomorrow's going to be beautiful." I didn't answer. Instead, I looked out across the lawn. I imagined the chairs filled, the music beginning, the petals lining the aisle. And then I imagined the silence after my last word. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't accuse. I wouldn't cry or shake or ask questions. I'd just speak. Clearly, cleanly, so no one could say they didn't understand. Jason squeezed my hand. I let him. I love you, he said. I turned and looked at him. You say that so easily, I said, like it still means the same thing. He blinked, mouth parting. I didn't wait. I'll see you tomorrow. Then I walked back to the car alone. At home, I peeled off the blue dress and hung it over the back of a chair. I made tea, sat in the dark, and opened the vow book. The last page I'd written still held the weight of the night before. I added just one line more. I am not waiting for anyone to come save me. That's how I know I've already begun. I wrote the vows on linen paper. Not because anyone would see the original, but because it felt right. The texture slowed my hand, made each word feel heavier, like it belonged. I started early that morning before the sun had fully risen, while the house was still asleep. The light was that soft gray blue you only get for a few minutes, the kind that makes everything look cleaner than it is. I sat at the kitchen table with the vow book open in front of me, my mother's brooch beside the candle, a pen that bled just slightly too much ink. It began as a whisper, not on the page in my head. A small line, quiet and dry truth, doesn't need a witness to matter. I wrote that down first, centered it, then I began. The words came slowly, not like speech, more like steps down a hallway you've never walked before. Every few lines I'd stop and run my fingers over the paper. Feel the drag of the pen, hear the silence gather around me like cloth. They weren't vows in the traditional sense. There were no promises to love, to obey, to build a life. Instead, they were fragments of what had been done and what I had learned to carry because of it. I wrote about the weight of watching, about the burn of knowing and saying nothing. I wrote, there is a version of me who would have spoken softly and carried your name like a precious thing. But you didn't marry her. You unwound her before she could finish dressing. I wrote love doesn't look like silence. It doesn't hide behind late-night texts or perfume on another woman's coat. It doesn't ask me to disappear to keep the peace. I wrote about lavender, about the pieces of me they thought were decorations, the bouquets Lila stole, the scent Jason forgot wasn't hers, the softness I gave both of them freely how they wore it like a costume until it wrinkled and then left it behind. I wrote, you borrowed my devotion like a suit you didn't plan to return. That wasn't love, that was looting. Each word became steadier than the last, each sentence closer to something final. I taped a few petals between the pages. Midnight lavender, crisp curling at the edges. They left faint stains the way bruises do on thin skin. And then I got to the last line, the one that would follow me down the aisle like a quiet drumbeat. I do not belong to anyone who asks me to stay small. That was it. I stared at it. Read it aloud once. My voice didn't tremble. Afterward, I placed the vow book gently on top of the quilt in the wooden box. Closed the latch. I didn't need to rehearse. That afternoon, while the world thought I was out picking up last-minute ribbon or collecting programs, I returned to the venue alone. Margie the planner looked surprised. Did you forget something? No, I said, just wanted to walk it again. She smiled. Most brides are too nervous to think straight at this point. You're calm. I nodded. I've already lived the hard part. She offered to walk with me, but I declined. I stepped through the reception hall first. Everything was in place. White linen, gold cutlery flowers I had arranged myself. I knew where everyone would sit. I knew who would be watching, who wouldn't blink fast enough when I began to speak. In the garden, I stood at the altar and closed my eyes. The air smelled like fresh rain and scorched rosemary. I imagined the guests arriving. I imagined Lila in her ivory, Jason sweating through his collar, the pastor smiling unaware. I didn't plan to mention names. I wouldn't need to. The vow book would do the work. All I had to do was open it. When I returned home, I found Jason asleep on the couch. He'd kicked off his shoes like he lived here, like this life was still his to relax into. I stood in the doorway and watched him. There was a time I would have crawled in beside him, let his arm wrap around me, pretended that presence meant safety. Now, I only saw a man who thought he'd gotten away with something. In the guest room, I passed Lila's silk robe hanging on the hook behind the door. I didn't touch it. I didn't smell it. I simply looked at it until it stopped meaning anything. Before bed, I lit a candle beside the window. The same one I always light when I need to remind myself I am not made of glass. The flame danced steady and low. I opened my journal, not the vow book. The other one, the one where I collect lines, not meant for public reading. I wrote, "This is the moment before the curtain rises, the hush before the first breath. They don't know yet, but I do." Then I blew out the candle and slept, not deeply, but soundly, with no dreams I needed to wake from. The morning of the wedding, I woke to light on my face. It filtered through the gauzy white curtains I'd hung 2 years earlier before Jason had ever proposed. Light like that doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives soft and sure and settles on you like truth. I lay there for a while, not moving, just listening to the birds, to the stillness, to the slow sound of my own breathing. It was the first morning in weeks I didn't feel hunted by silence. I got up, made coffee, stirred in the sugar, even though I rarely do. Today wasn't about routines, it was about clarity. The vow book sat closed on the kitchen table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to reread it. Every word lived in my body, now pressed into the backs of my teeth, the fold of my throat. I had spoken it to myself in the mirror last night, watched my mouth shape each sentence like it belonged. I dressed slowly, white satin, no lace, nothing borrowed. My mother's brooch pinned under the left side of my bodice, right over my ribs. A private memory, not a display. The fabric fell heavy and clean, no sparkle, no illusion. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who could wreck a room with a sentence. Lila knocked once and let herself in. Of course she did. Her hair was pinned back in curls, a few strands falling loose in carefully calculated disarray. She wore ivory. Again. The neckline was different, a mock halter cut, but the message was the same. She'd never needed permission to take up space. "You ready?" she asked, smiling. I looked at her, at the tiny gold studs in her ears, the shimmer on her collarbone, the perfume that arrived a second before she did. "I am," I said. She walked around the room like it was hers, adjusted a pillow, picked up a lip balm that wasn't hers and applied it. "Jason's already there," she said. "He's pacing. Is he nervous?" She shrugged. "Men always are." She moved to the mirror and touched her hair. "Did you sleep well?" I asked. She paused mid-adjustment. "Yeah, actually. You perfectly." There was a long moment where neither of us spoke. She turned toward me, smile soft. "Elle, I know things have been weird." "Weird?" I repeated. She winced just slightly. "I just mean, this has been a lot. Planning everything, all the pressure. It can make people read into things." I nodded. "It can. I want today to be good," she said. "For you?" There was a flicker behind her eyes, a tightening of her jaw. Her fingers rubbed the side of her dress like they were trying to remember what guilt felt like. I picked up the vow book from the table. "It will be," I said. "Good, I mean." We drove separately. I needed the quiet. The venue looked untouched since the rehearsal. Clean white chairs lined the garden aisle. Flower petals had been scattered along the path, roses and lavender, of course. Jason had asked for it in one of our planning sessions. It's our thing, he'd said. The scent hit me before I stepped out of the car. Lavender. Midnight variety. Heavy in the air. I walked the perimeter of the space away from the bridal suite. I wasn't interested in champagne or small talk or forced photographs. I walked in silence, past the rows of chairs, past the stone fountain, around the back of the altar. The sun was rising higher. The light hit the top of the pergola in long streaks. Bees hovered near the roses. Someone in the distance, probably a sound tech, was testing music levels. I stopped beneath the trellis and stood there, hand on the vow book, feeling the weight of it press against my hip. A year ago, I'd pictured this moment differently. I'd imagined Jason's face full of awe. I'd imagined Lila crying happy tears. I'd imagined a new beginning. Now I saw all of it for what it was. A play, a stage set for a truth no one had rehearsed. Behind me, I heard someone call my name. I turned. It was Margie, clipboard in hand, smiling wide. "You're early," she said. "I like to know where I'm standing." She laughed, then stepped closer. "Everyone's arriving. You look calm." "I am." She adjusted her headset and lowered her voice. "Your sister said you might be nervous. She's been fluttering around all morning." "Has she?" I told her not to worry. "You're the kind of bride who makes it all look effortless." I smiled, small and clean. "Thank you." As she walked off, I stood there alone again. I thought about my mother, how she would have hated the show of it all, but admired the structure. She believed in saying things plainly, in leaving the room when it stopped being yours. I looked down at the vow book, then out at the aisle. This wasn't just a walk forward, it was a departure. Not from love. I still believed in that, but from pretending. Pretending not to see. Pretending not to know. Pretending that the ache inside me was just nerves and not a map of every place I'd already left behind. I stood at the edge of the aisle and breathed. There would be music soon. Faces turned toward me, the flutter of expectation. But for now, it was just light and air, the moment before the doors open, the silence before the blade lands, and I had never felt more ready. The music began. Soft piano, the kind meant to glide you forward without ever fully announcing itself. I stood just inside the doors alone, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the frame. They'd offered me an escort down the aisle, a cousin maybe, or my father. I said no. If I was going to walk into a room full of people I'd been pretending for, I'd do it on my own legs. I stepped out into the light. Everything looked exactly the way we'd planned. Rows of white chairs, petals scattered along the aisle, the arch laced in lavender and freesia. Faces turned, mouths, parting eyes, soft with expectation. But none of it touched me, not in the way they wanted it to. I caught sight of Jason at the altar. Standing tall, suit-pressed hair, too neatly combed. His hands were clasped in front of him like he didn't know what to do with them. His mouth twitched into a smile when he saw me. And then I saw her. Lila, front row, ivory dress. Legs crossed at the ankle like she was sitting for a portrait. Her hair swept back, face carefully undone. She wasn't smiling. She was watching me the way someone watches a fire they lit from across the field. Too far to burn them. Close enough to feel the heat. I walked down the aisle slowly. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Just measured. The weight of the vow book in my hands kept me grounded. I felt the petals crunch lightly under my shoes. When I reached the altar, Jason stepped forward to take my hand. I let him. The officiant began. She spoke of love, of connection, of two people choosing each other fully. The usual script delivered with a warmth I almost respected. Jason nodded along. I looked at his profile, how easily he played the part. The tenderness in his posture. The quiet confidence of someone who still believed the curtain hadn't lifted yet. But I wasn't here for a show. When it came time for our vows, the officiant turned to Jason. He pulled a folded page from his jacket pocket. His voice was steady. Polished. He spoke about our first meeting, about how I'd taught him to slow down to pay attention. He said I was his calm, his compass. He thanked me for making him a better man. I didn't blink once. When he finished, there were soft sighs in the audience. A few people dabbed at their eyes. I waited until the quiet settled, then took a single step forward. I wrote mine by hand, I said. My voice carried. I opened the vow book and looked down at the first line. But I didn't read from it, not yet. I looked up. At Lila, then at Jason, and then at everyone else. My name is Ellen Breyer, I said. And before I speak these words, I want you to hear this. The woman standing here today is not confused. She's not afraid. And she's not going to stay silent. There was a shift. A ripple. I turned to Jason as if I were about to speak to him, as if I'd been planning to all along. Instead, I read the first line of my vow. Love is not something you hide behind closed doors. It is not a lie told through omission or a secret passed between sheets that were never yours to begin with. Jason's eyes darted to mine. His hand dropped. I continued. I came here today prepared to marry a man who used my kindness as camouflage, who wore my loyalty like it was his to ruin, who thought silence meant I hadn't noticed. There was a rustle from the guests, a few gasps. Someone in the second row shifted forward. The photographer lowered his camera. But I did notice. I noticed every time my sister stayed too long. Every time your phone lit up and your eyes wouldn't meet mine. Every piece of lavender that went missing from my shop left crushed in the lining of a coat that wasn't mine. Lila's face had gone blank. I wrote these vows not to marry you, Jason. I wrote them to remember myself. To remember that I don't need to explain the ways I've been hurt just to justify walking away. Jason stepped forward, lips parting. Ellen, I held up a hand. Not harsh, just final. I do not. Silence. Real silence. The kind that drops heavy. The kind that sucks the breath from a room. I closed the vow book, and I turned. No one tried to stop me. I walked back down the aisle in reverse, each step deliberate, unshaking. I passed the same rows of chairs, the same petals. But now the silence was mine. It wasn't a trap. It was a choice. Outside the sun was warm. I kept walking. I didn't cry. Didn't run. Just moved forward. The ceremony music had stopped, but I didn't notice when. It didn't matter. Behind me they were probably whispering. Maybe someone was standing. Maybe Lila had gotten up, tried to explain, tried to spin it. Maybe Jason was still standing there, wondering how the ground had shifted so completely beneath him. But none of it belonged to me anymore. Not the altar, not the silence, not even the lavender. Only the vow book. Only the truth. And the way my voice sounded when it was finally mine. The car was waiting where I'd asked it to be, at the far end of the gravel lot behind the vendor entrance, just past the row of magnolia trees. I'd booked it a week ago under my maiden name. Paid in advance. No note, no call, no warning. Just one quiet arrangement made while they were all too busy choreographing lies. I didn't look back. Not when I passed the rose arch. Not when the venue faded behind me. Not when the air changed warmer and wider, the farther I stepped from the altar. The driver didn't ask questions. Middle-aged man in a navy windbreaker, quiet eyes. He opened the door, nodded once. I slid into the back seat, vow book still in my hand. The door shut with a sound I'll remember forever. Final. Clean. We pulled away slowly. Dust kicked up in the mirror. No one chased me. No one called. I kept my eyes forward. For the first few miles, neither of us said anything. Just the soft hum of tires on old pavement, the clicking turn signal at intersections. I pressed my fingers into the cover of the vow book and watched fields roll by in swatches of gold and green. I didn't realize I was still holding my breath until we reached the bridge out of town. Then I exhaled. Not relief, not quite. More like space. That rare kind of breath that doesn't need to defend itself. The driver glanced in the mirror. "You all right back there?" I nodded. "You leaving a wedding?" I looked out the window. Something like that. He didn't ask anything more. Just drove. God bless him. We passed the edge of town, the bakery where Jason first told me he loved me, the school where Lila once taught kindergarten before switching to event planning. Familiar places, all rendered unfamiliar now, like someone had scrubbed the color out of them. The ribbon from my bouquet was still tied around my wrist. I'd worn it there as a soft touch, a private thing. I untied it now, slowly, loop by loop, and let it fall onto the seat beside me. A woman starting over doesn't need symbols, only choices. At the next red light, I opened the vow book. Not to read, just to feel it open again. The pages shifted like breath. Between the last lines I'd read aloud and the blank ones waiting at the end, there was a space, a break I'd left on purpose. That space was mine, a space where nothing needed to be said to matter, where I didn't have to perform or carry or nod along to someone else's story. I closed the book. The driver turned onto my road without needing directions. I'd written it all out clearly in the pickup request. The house came into view slowly, tucked between trees, the shutters slightly askew from last winter's storms. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It was mine. The porch light was already on automatic, triggered by dusk. The same kind of quiet welcome I'd forgotten to notice all these years. He pulled into the driveway, shifted the car into park. "You need help with anything?" I shook my head. "No, thank you." I stepped out, vow book in hand, and walked up the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath me like always, familiar, unapologetic. When I turned the key and stepped inside, the air smelled like rosemary and cedar. I'd left a candle burning in the foyer, one of the slow drip ones I make for the shop. It flickered behind its glass jar, steady and gold. I dropped my heels by the door, towed them off like someone leaving behind a disguise. The dress came next. I unzipped it in the hallway, let it fall into my arms, and folded it once before placing it over the back of the living room chair. It didn't belong in a closet. It didn't belong to any future version of me. Barefoot, I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, leaned against the counter, and waited. Not for anyone, just for the moment to settle. I took a sip. The silence wrapped around me. But this time, it didn't ask anything of me. It didn't tighten. It didn't test. It simply existed, like breath, like light. I stood in the kitchen and looked out the window into the night. There were no cars in the driveway, no voices, no footsteps on the stairs. Just the soft sound of the candle flickering in the other room. The weight of the vow book on the counter, and the hush that comes after something breaks clean. When I finally moved, I walked down the hallway past the guest room. The robe was still hanging behind the door. I pulled it down, folded it, and placed it in a cardboard box beside her heels and perfume. No drama, no notes, just an exit. One box on the porch. One woman left standing. and not a single part of me wished it had gone differently. The first thing I did the next morning was strike a match. I stood on the back porch in my slippers, and robe vow book resting on the small table beside me, a tin bowl at my feet. The air was clean, not cold, not warm, that in-between kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. The box of letters I'd written, the ones I never sent, sat in my lap. 12 in total, each folded, sealed, some with creases soft from being opened and reread a dozen times. I held the top one for a while, running my thumb along the edge. It was addressed to Leela. You wore my skin like it was yours, I'd written. You spoke with my voice and thought I wouldn't notice. But I did. I noticed you taking and calling it love. I struck the match, watched it catch. The paper curled quickly, edges blackening, ink bleeding. I dropped it in the tin bowl and watched the rest follow, one by one. A controlled burn. Jason's letters were next, each one harsher than the last. None of them kind, none of them confused. The last one, written just days ago, simply said, You never really saw me. You just wanted someone who wouldn't look back. I burned that one last. The fire glowed white in the early light. No smoke, no drama, just heat. By the time I reached the bottom of the stack, my hands smelled like ash. I didn't mind. There's something sacred about burning what no longer serves you. Something deeply private, like turning pain into air. I stood in the silence and let it rise around me. Inside the house was still. No ticking clock, no buzzing phone, no one asking what's next. I opened the windows, let the wind move through the rooms. In the guest room, I stripped the bed and opened the closet. Empty now. The box I'd left for Lila was gone this morning. Picked up quietly, no call, no message, just a clean vanishing, fitting. In the shop, I unlocked the door and flipped the sign to closed. Not for the day, for the week. I needed time. Time to unlearn, time to reclaim. There was a whiteboard near the register, where I usually wrote, quotes, soft things, hopeful things. I wiped it clean and wrote one new sentence in black marker, truth blooms loudest when no one's listening. Then I started on the new floral series. I called it Truth in Bloom. No roses, no peonies, no sweet, polite flowers. These were arrangements built from honesty, from bold lines and unsoft edges. Midnight lavender eucalyptus, dried yarrow black calla lilies. Things that didn't wilt when stared at too long. I made 6 that first day, each one different, each one deliberate. The 7th came late in the evening when the sun was throwing amber light through the back windows. I was standing barefoot on the shop floor, hair pinned up, vow book open beside me. This arrangement I made for myself. No recipient, no delivery tag. I laid each stem like a sentence, wrapped the bouquet in linen, tied it with the same blue ribbon I'd worn on my wrist the morning of the wedding, and I placed it in the center of the front window. A kind of final word. At home that night, I lit the last candle from the set Jason had given me on our first anniversary. I hadn't touched them in years. They were meant to smell like fur and smoke. They just smelled like memory now. I let it burn until the wax reached the bottom, then tossed the jar in the bin. That's the thing no one tells you: grief has to be invited out. You can't chase it. You can't bury it under survival. You have to open the door and let it walk itself into the light. I went to bed clean, unburdened. I didn't think about the wedding, didn't think about the guests or the looks or the phone calls I hadn't answered. I slept with the window open, and when I woke, I was still breathing. That sounds simple, but it's not. It means I didn't carry it into the next day. Not the anger, not the story, only the truth. The next morning, a woman came into the shop. Older, mid-60s maybe. Hair cut short, eyes steady. She held a newspaper clipping of my Truth in Bloom display. Said she'd lost her husband the year before. That she didn't want a sympathy bouquet. She wanted something that said, "I'm still here." I nodded, didn't speak. Just pulled down a bundle of midnight lavender and began. Late summer is when the woods behind my house begin to shift. The green deepens. The light turns amber around the edges, catching on every surface like it wants to stay. I started walking out there every evening after closing the shop, following the same path my mother used to take when her voice felt too big for the walls. There's a clearing near the bend, not wide, but open enough to feel the sky. That's where I planted the wildflowers. I'd ordered them the week after I walked out of the wedding. A mix of things that don't ask for attention: blue flax, black-eyed Susan's poppies that come in soft waves, stubborn little stems of yarrow. I didn't want a garden. I wanted proof of something that could survive untouched. I planted them slowly, kneeling in the dirt, fingers deep in soil, the vow book tucked beside me. Not for ceremony, not for symbolism, just to have it near. That evening, I stood barefoot in the clearing, the sun grazing the tops of my shoulders, the earth still warm from the day. The first poppy had opened small, bright, brave. I didn't say anything at first, just watched. And then, like breath, the words came. Not to the air. To me. I picked up the vow book, flipped to the final blank page. The paper felt heavier than it had weeks ago. It had absorbed everything I hadn't said aloud. I began writing. I vow to stop holding the door open for people who walk in just to steal the light. I vow to speak even when no one is listening, especially then. I vow not to fold myself in half just to keep someone else whole. I vow to never again confuse silence with grace. I wrote slowly, like each word needed room to root. The final line came without effort. It had been living in me long before I ever wrote it down. I vow to never lower my voice so someone else can rest easy in their lie. I read it once aloud. The trees didn't answer. The wind didn't shift. But something inside me settled. Not resolved, not tied up like a ribbon, but anchored. At the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. A deer quiet and still watching me. Not startled, just there, present. We watched each other for a while, both of us suspended in something unspoken. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. No sound. No goodbye. Back inside, the shop smelled of lavender and iron. I'd left a new arrangement on the counter: eucalyptus thistle, scattered freesia. A note beside it read, "Pick up at 5. I washed my hands in the basin behind the register, the soil swirling into the drain. Out front, the sun was lowering, casting the whole street in gold. I unlocked the front door, flipped the sign to open, and waited. Not for Jason, not for Lila, for the right things. The kind that arrive without disguise, without lies in their pockets. There would be more betrayal in the world, more theft, more soft women asked to stay soft while others burned them. But not here, not now, not with me. That night, I sat in bed with the windows open, the vow book on my lap. No pen in hand, just quiet. The candle on the sill burned low, slow. Sure, tomorrow would come, and I would meet it standing,